what are we cultivating in our kids? Like, do we want to raise extremely obedient kids who are not troublemakers when we're watching, right? Or do we want to raise children that will go and make a difference in the world, that will question authority in a respectful way, that have an intact sense of personal autonomy, that when they make a decision, they will own kind of what they did? Because when you have this top-down approach, your kids don't own what they did. You can force them to own what they did by saying the words, but that's really different than true ownership of your actions and life responsibility.
Today's guest is an author who holds a PhD in neuroscience. As an assistant professor, she teaches developmental biology and neurobiology and heads an active research program that investigates questions about how the brain functions. She is also interested in incorporating neuroscience principles into the classroom, in service learning, and in providing hands-on learning experiences. She writes for Psychology Today, Mindbodygreen, Today Parenting, and many other publications. For me, her dedication to her work is evident as she pursued her PhD while having her 4 kids who are roughly 2 years apart. That in itself deserves a medal in my book. Actively working to help parents and kids understand the way their brains develop, her mission is to help families relate to each other better with greater empathy, creativity, and self-control so that we can all raise kids that can thrive. It is my pleasure to introduce you all to the amazing Erin Clabough. Erin, welcome to Empowered Kids TV.
Thank you, Nicole.
I want to dive right in. Your book was one that took me in places that I was excited to explore from a brain perspective because it helped me understand not just my kids, but myself a lot better. So I'd like to dive right in and talk about the science behind how we learn and form habits. Can you help us break that down?
Yes, I can. And I agree with you. When I started writing this book, I didn't write it for myself per se. I wrote it to try to understand how to parent my kids. And there's no way that you can teach these skills and these habits to your kids without it seeping into yourself. So that was one kind of byproduct from writing the book, is that I found I had these tools that I didn't have before, and I was holding myself to a different standard that I didn't before. And I was putting myself in these mindful moments, and I was trying actively to use empathy every day. So it is a modeling thing, but it actually, like, when you're trying to give your kid this gift, you can't give it without understanding it. And so this was really important for me as a journey as well. So in terms of learning habits in the brain, the reason that I wrote this section of the book, which is one of the chapters that really just dives into the way that neurons connect together, it has this basic premise to it, is that in neurodevelopment, that we make more of everything than we actually need. So we make 2 times as many neurons that we need. We make way more connections between the neurons than we'll ever use. And as you grow up, the process of becoming who you are is the weeding out of the synapses that are unused and the dying off of the neurons that never make proper connections, because there's no sense in putting all those resources towards supporting cells that aren't helpful.
Yes.
So as kind of a parent taking this perspective, you understand that if you take a skill or any kind of thing that you want to become a habit in your child, and you simply have them do it, then it will strengthen it. And I think we kind of know this as parents. We say practice makes perfect and things like this. But I think it's equally important to understand that if you do not want it to be a habit, then do not put those like kind of reinforcing experiences in your kid's path, and they will not become that. So if a synapse is not used, the body will get rid of it. If you don't support a synapse, that the body will get rid of it because we don't want to give resources to something that's not serving us as an individual. So like in terms of thinking about things like creativity or empathy or these behaviors that we think of more as character traits, as a habit, this is something that I never thought about before looking at the research. And really, we think about habits in terms of getting up early, or being a neat person, or practicing the piano. These are kind of habits. But the idea of having a habit of creativity, or a habit of empathy, is different, because it's basically a life approach. It's the way we're coming up to a problem and trying to figure it out. And these are more learning habits. So this is the way that we kind of come in wide open to lots of different options, or we come in used to doing it a certain way. And it's really important to understand the difference between these routine habits, which is that we're rote doing things the same way every day, versus a habit of an approach to life.
I get it. I get it. And that's beautiful. It brings up a concern for me. I think most of the parents that are in our village are actively working to parent through connection. But I think part of my mission is to reach parents that are still in that place of control-based parenting, so that we can show them alternatives and the impact of alternatives. What do we say to parents who firmly believe that by using punishment, whether it's sitting in a naughty corner or spanking a kid, it really helps a child understand not to repeat that behavior in a quick way so it doesn't become a habit? What does the research say about what kids learn from that type of experience?
Well, I think that there's a lot of studies on, behaviorism and this like operant conditioning that is basically reward-based behavior. And so Skinner did a lot of this work many decades ago in the psychology field. And he showed really effectively that in pigeons and in rats and things like this, if you give a reward, or if you give a punishment right after a behavior, it will control the way that they behave. They are very kind of attuned to that. And if it's something like a shock, then you only need to do one trial and they will learn it. But these are animals. These are not children, right? And so I think that he really did this giant disservice to psychology, and he's pretty a controversial figure, because everyone jumped on board and said, oh, we can control behavior. Let's do that. But what you're missing there in these behaviorism models of reward and punishment based consequences is that you completely take out the idea of human dignity and of human free will, and of somebody kind of coming into this world already the way that they are, already with a persona, and you're imposing what your view of right and wrong is on them. And so this idea of like morality and where that comes from, it is important for parents to be a good moral model, but we really have to think about what are we cultivating in our kids? Like, do we want to raise extremely obedient kids who are not troublemakers when we're watching, right? Or do we want to raise children that will go and make a difference in the world, that will question authority in a respectful way, that have an intact sense of personal autonomy, that when they make a decision, they will own kind of what they did? Because when you have this top-down approach, your kids don't own what they did. You can force them to own what they did by saying the words, but that's really different than true ownership of your actions and life responsibility. And so you're basically grooming them to be compliant to the rules around them. And a much better way to do it, just in terms of preserving sense of self, is to allow them to be participatory in the rules and the consequences a little bit more and more each year as they grow, so that by the time that they're 18 and it's time for them to leave the house, hopefully, then they will know what it's like to drive their own life, to have goals that they work towards that are their goals and not your goals. And I think this is really hard for parents to do, because the idea of letting go of control is really scary, because we put a lot of pressure on parents to be good parents. And if you say, well, I just let go, we're going to say, you did what? Like, you can't just let your kid do whatever he wants. You're shirking your responsibility. You're not raising an upstanding citizen. But I do feel like the the definition of parenting has really changed in the last couple of decades, from parents that are very authoritative figures, or authoritarian, to parents who really, there's a lot of research out there about responsiveness and being attuned to a child and not being super rigid. Because we have to remember that rules should be there to keep people safe and to teach them about kind of the way the world works. But they shouldn't be the focus of the family, where there is like a cost where you don't connect, you don't have a relationship, because everything's focused on rule following instead of connecting.
I love it. And that leads me quite beautifully into my next question. I think when we look at skill development, the skills that our kids needed 50 to 100 years ago to be able to be successful and to thrive is very different to the skills that kids need now. And especially with what's happening globally, there's going to be a real shift in the core skills that kids need in order to be successful. In your book, you identify 3 core skills, and I think it's skills that are critical for our kids to develop at this time. Can you walk us through those 3 skills?
Sure. Yeah. So these are 3 skills that they have a biological basis to them. They for the most part, cannot be done by a computer. So this is empathy. So empathy has a couple of different subsections, but you can have thinking empathy, which technically you might be able to do as a computer, just being able to put yourself in someone else's perspective or predict behavior. You have like an emotional empathy, which is feeling emotions, which a computer may not feel emotions. And then you have like an applied empathy, which we would think of as compassion. So compassion is going to be like an act of empathy, where you're reaching outside of yourself to make things different for somebody else. So when you reach outside yourself to make things different for somebody else, this really is what makes a difference in the world. So that's the first one, is empathy. The second one is going to be creativity. And creativity is, again, divided into multiple parts. The first part is going to be more of like an Eastern perspective, where you're thinking about kind of self-actualization or expression, self-expression. And then the Western view of creativity is a little bit different. It's more ideas that are new and are useful. So you have to have a different way of doing something that when you apply it, it makes life better or easier. So these 2 things together are both aspects of creativity. But the reason that creativity is so important for us in our society in the next couple of decades coming up is because the ideas that we can generate and our capacity to fail and then to try again, these things are problem solving in a nutshell. They're using things that we knew in a different realm and applying them in a new way. Computers have a really hard time doing that. And the reason is because computers follow rules, and creativity does not have rules. It is kind of the opposite of that. It is embracing what it feels like to have no rules, which again can be kind of scary too. We're scared to fail. So this skill of creativity also really links back to the first one of empathy, because in order to understand how someone else feels, you have to be able to creatively imagine what it would be like to be that person, what their hopes, desires, dreams, what emotions they might be feeling. And even more, to have an act of compassion, you have to not only understand what they want, hope, feel, dream, but you have to understand many ways that you could act to make that better. Pick one that doesn't hurt anybody else, helps them, and maybe doesn't hurt you as well, and give it to them or do that for them. So that is really important, that those things go together in a way that a lot of people don't see, that empathy and creativity are really joined together. And then the third one is self-control. And so self-control is something that we would think that a computer kind of has a lot of self-control, right? Because it's following this rote thing. But we need to understand self-control as basically us telling ourselves a no. I can't do that. You can't do that. I have to do that. Like, it's very personal and it's very self-directed. The opposite kind of that is self-regulation. And this is the one big skill that we really need to focus on, that creativity and empathy can help with self-control to get to self-regulation. So self-regulation is a yes. So it's how can I get to the thing that I want without hurting somebody else, and think about a creative way to get there. So you have to have self-control to kind of crush your first impulse. But if you only have self-control, you're going to be a really unfulfilled person. It's a life of, of really being miserly about everything, good things, bad things, right? You're very controlled.
Yeah.
Right. And so this idea of how do I use empathy and creativity and self-control my first impulse to go around what's the no to try to get the yes, right? In a way that doesn't hurt anybody else. So those are the three core skills. And if you think about those core skills, not only can computers not do them, but you also cannot force a child to do any one of those three things. It's impossible. And so we're asking for our kids to learn these skills. And it's so frustrating for parents to know that they are the most important skills and you cannot make them do them. They all require space. They all require you to look inward. They all require a moment, right, of processing and of choice. So they're all decision-based. I could do it this way, but I'm not, for the sake of me and others, going to do that. I'm going to do it this other way instead.
You know what I love about all three of those? And it comes full circle, and I love the beauty of the conversation we're having. For me, what resonates is that I can't be in a space where I'm truly creative or I'm being empathetic if I'm not first connected with myself. And you said to look within. And that for me is what connection is, that looking within and that resonance within. And why I love the conversation, the flow of the conversation, is because we started talking about parents that are still maybe holding on to a controlled based way of parenting. And as you move a child from looking within to their own impulses and learning how to manage those impulses, and you say, do as I say. In essence, what you're doing is creating a habit where they lose that connection and that ability to continuously look within, and instead look outside of themselves for direction of what to do next and what may be right or wrong. So I'm loving the conversation where we have to take a step back and say, if these are going to be the critical skills for my kids, how do I then take a step back if I have been in that controlling space as a parent, and begin now to practice myself looking within so that I can model it, and then do that for my kids. And that's why I like the element of the conversation between self-control and regulation. And I wanted to kind of explore that in a bit more detail. I'd like us to kind of work out what's involved in developing self-control versus self-regulation.
Well, self-control, if you think of it as just being a no, is just the ability for somebody to inhibit impulsive behavior. This is why we have lots of grade school kids who are in timeout or in a special desk right next to the teacher because they have done something they weren't supposed to do, right? It's being able to not blurt out the answer, right? It's being able to not poke somebody who's right next to you with your hand because they're just sitting there and you can't help it, right? For us as a grown-up, it's the ability to not eat the final slice of cake when we love the cake and we might be on a diet and our brother hasn't had a slice yet, right? So these are all no's, no, 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 no. And I think the difference here is we have to shift the entire conversation to a yes. And so you can have these conversations with yourself or with your child. You can say, you blurted out the answer. Let's just use that as an example. Why is that not an okay thing to do? And have them come up with the reasons why. I'm sure they would say because you'll get mad, right? Or I'll get in trouble. But like deeper than that, how does it impact the teacher? How does it impact their own ability to learn? How does it impact everybody else's ability to learn? How does it impact Joey sitting over there, whoever it is? How does it impact the teacher's end of the year performance report? How does it impact her stress levels, right? There are so many things that go into that, and how about this person? And how about this person? Just how does it impact them? And then when you ask them, like, why did they do it? They might say, because I knew the answer. They might say, because I knew the answer. But the question then becomes, why do they feel compelled to blurt, right? Mm-hmm. So if you kind of turn the no into a yes, you can have them come up with a list of all the other things they could have done rather than blurt it out. And these become tricks or tools that our kids can do to basically control themselves with a goal in mind. Because the only way that you can control your own behavior is for yourself or for someone else. You're going to do it for someone else if you feel empathy towards them and don't want to disrupt their experience, right? You might be able to feel bad for someone else. You can do it for yourself, usually only if you have a goal that you're working toward. And so if our child is working towards a goal of not getting in trouble, it's not a very strong reinforcer, right? Because it's not for themselves. But if it's for a goal for themselves of something else, then we can kind of shift that. Right? So this is where you see a lot of kind of sticker charts and things like this come into play in classrooms and things like that. And I feel like the sticker charts I kind of have ambivalent feelings about, because if used correctly, I think that they can be really good things. If used incorrectly, I think they can do a lot of damage, especially when you link one kid's behavior to somebody else's behavior so that kids lose the autonomy of being in control. That's hard. So if you say, if everyone has 13 stickers by the end of the week, we'll have a pizza party. And then, you know what I mean? You're not in control of what somebody else does. That's hard. But I think stickers or things like that are rewards, particularly if the child is involved in choosing those rewards, I think that's a great way to have them work towards goal-based behaviors. Because the thing about the self-control is that no matter how the child practices the self-control, it will become better and stronger, right? So what you're trying to do is find a way to have them practice it that's healthy for them, where they still feel like, oh, well, my goal is just to not get in trouble. That's an okay goal, right? How can we get you there? When you feel like you want to blurt it out, tell me 5 things you can do instead. And use one of them every hour, right? They've done a lot of studies on this, how do you get children to wait? How do you get children to do these kind of things where they're still it's hard? And they've done studies where they'll ask children on the playground to pretend like they're soldiers guarding an imaginary prisoner, and they can wait for way, way longer when they're doing this pretend game than they can when they're just asked to wait 10 minutes more. And I couldn't sit there and probably wait for 10 minutes. So this idea of tricking yourself so that you're able to control your own behavior is healthy. It's good, and it requires imagination. You've got to say, okay, if I want to blurt out the answer, I am going to, wait until I see 5 other kids, hands up, and a bird fly through the window, past the window. And then it's practice in these little ways. When is it okay? And so that is self-regulation. The not blurting out is the self-control. All the ways that you use as a person to try to make it so that you can say the answer just a little bit later, and you do get to your goal of the stickers or whatever it is at the end of the day, that's the regulation part. And that's the part you have to have strong creative skills, and you have to have strong sense of empathy to be able to do it effectively, no matter what the motivation, whether it's for yourself or for somebody else. You don't want your motivation to be, though, not being punished necessarily. That's something that it might be a pretty valid, that is a life lesson, but there's no need that the kids need to learn that, basically punishment avoidance in primary school. That shouldn't be their number one reason to not do something.
And I think all it does is it takes away the focus on building regulation. And now I use all my creativity as a kid to figure out how not to get in trouble. What I loved about that, Erin, is that I heard two things. First of all, I think where we stumble as parents is in trying to get our kids to develop self-control. It's the why did you hit? I've told you 100 times. There's no biting. There's no kicking. You should share your toy. Tidy up your room. All the things that we have arguments over with our kids is really about self-control. But hand on heart, if we're really analyzing what we do within our families, most of us stop at the self-control by asking our kids over and over to have self-control, but never really go in terms of helping our kids develop the yes, which is the self-regulation. And that's why we get stuck so long in trying to develop self-control, because we've not given them the tools to have the self-regulation.
Right. And the actual pathways in the brain that allow us to have really mature self-control, they aren't developed until we're way older than primary school. And so we're literally asking the kids to do something that their brain is not developed enough to do, but not showing them how to work around it to be able to have these other tools at their disposal, so that on the surface, we have a classroom that's manageable. So we end up in timeouts all the time, or we end up with these punishing things. And then we have kids whose self-esteem takes a hit, and they think, oh, I'll never be able to do it, so why even try? And then you have these problem behaviors that spiral. And the original nugget there is that they didn't know how to do it any other way, and their brains weren't able to do a straight no yet. Like, humans weren't designed to be the creatures of self-control. This is something that is against, like, it's hard. It's not only hard, but it literally takes brain energy. Like, our neurons have to work harder during self-control. We use more glucose during it. We can become deprived, like, we give up on hard tasks faster if we're having to exert self-control first. These things, like, there is a neurological cost to self-control. It's not easy to do, but what is easy to do is problem solving and kind of finding ways around that. And so pushing a kid into something that their brains at that point is more designed to do easier and also cultivating these other two skills, which will make them, have a lot more options down the road. That's a better way to do it. And in terms of how do you start doing that, if you are a parent who's always been, this is the way because I said so, it's really hard to go from all to like none. And so, like, the stepwise process for that would start little. It would start, by saying, here are your two choices, you choose one, and start getting them used to making their own decisions. And then this idea of, like, when something happens where they were supposed to use self-control and didn't, go in there and just talk about it. So you were supposed to do this. This is why, right? Talk about the empathy, talk about, why it matters. And then say, what could you have done instead? And have the child say, okay, from my perspective, it was really hard to sit there. I couldn't do it. And then just come up with those couple ways. You could have done this, this, or this. And so when they're in that situation again, they have an out. They know, I can't do this. I can see I'm about to blurt this answer out. What can I do? Oh, my mom said I can do my alphabet backwards. Z, Y, X, W, V, U, T, S, right? So they have an option. So you're really giving the kids the freedom to behave, really.
Yeah, I love it. All right, let's take it into a practical, everyday. Every family that has more than one kid ends up in this scenario. So let's take this scenario and see, how do we cultivate the 3 skills of creativity, empathy, and self-control for this scenario. So it's my toy and he took it. Yeah. And then the other child goes, yeah, well, I was playing with it first and he hit me, Mom. So in comes Erin. How do we get the 3 skills developed in that situation?
Okay, so you've got your 2 different perspectives, right? Both perspectives are valid. So I guess I would come in and I would probably make a discernment as to whether we were in, like, danger mode. So did somebody get hurt, like, in a way that wasn't okay? And if so, I would probably take a gauge like of the temperatures in the room. So if somebody was not able to talk, I would say, okay, we're all gonna just take a quiet moment. We're gonna come back and talk about it. Typically, I would just take the toy until we are ready to talk about it. And then if they were okay to talk and they weren't super heated, then I would go ahead and just have the conversation about the toy. So I would say, what happened from, your side of it. And I would have the other child be absolutely quiet. And then I would say, okay, now you be quiet and you tell me exactly what happened in your words, start to finish. And no one's allowed to use name calling. No one's allowed to say he always does this or right. They're just factual is all I want. And then I can kind of tell whether the other person is lying or not, right? If the other person is saying, right? So then, I'll do a little back and forth to make sure I got the story straight. And then typically, if I know who the toy belongs to, I will end up saying it is that person's, because I don't want to take that ownership away from the first child. So I would say, he got it for his birthday present and we know that it's his. He doesn't have to let you use it. But then I would say to the child, I would say, but he was using it first and you came in the room, and you should, with all of our behaviors, we want to, be generous and share as long as it's not impacting you negatively, right? So if he's using it and he's going to break it, or he's doing something he's not supposed to, or you said he couldn't and he's doing it anyway, those are all not okay. But if you weren't using it and haven't seen it in 2 years because you haven't played with it and it's been under the couch, I would say probably, it's okay if he uses it. But I also would not make him share. So I would say, these are the reasons why it's logical to me that you should share. I'm going to give it back to you now. It's up to you if you decide to share or not. But, I wouldn't force, you can't force these things, because forcing means that you get blamed then as the parent when things go wrong, because you got involved and made it happen. So, right? So you say, I think, it makes sense to share here, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. And then if you do that and you kind of step back, obviously the person who got it taken from them is going to be really annoyed. But I still would just probably help that person find something new to do. Typically, I'll try a little harder than I normally would to try to get them engaged, depending on how old they are. If the younger they are, if it's something that is really nice and kind of fun and cool, the first person sometimes will shove their toy at them and say, no, I want to do that, right? But other times when they're older, they'll say, no, I don't want to do anything. And, I've gotten comfortable just sitting with that kind of gross feeling, because I know that when I get involved, it's not going to be better in the long term. So a lot of times you'll see that the first person will sit with that thing, the toy that they didn't really want anyway. They just didn't want their brother to have it. And sometimes that's enough for 10 minutes later for them just to kind of throw it at them as they walk out of the room, right? Because you don't want to be too kind as you're sharing. But I do feel like if you think about that situation, there's a lot of space in that situation for everyone to have their own feelings, to feel like they were heard, and to be able to make their own decisions based on what to do about it. The person who got it taken from them could certainly have a tantrum, have a fit, be annoyed for the rest of the day, but I feel like it's on them, right? It wasn't technically theirs to begin with. And so if they're an opportunist and they come in and that gets taken away, so be it. And I feel like there's a lot of kind of brainstorming there that both kids need to do in the aftermath of that about, how does this feel? How did that other person feel? That is the empathy part. And just when they get to tell their own side of the story, sometimes I'll say, if I can clearly see who was kind of in the wrong, I will walk them through, how do you think that made him feel, to the person who was the person who did something wrong, right? So how do you think it made them feel? And, how could you do it differently next time? And this would be in the case of a hitting. So if somebody hit, when somebody took it back, we would focus on the hitting there as something that's never okay. How did it make them feel, right? And once we're done with that, then we can move to the stealing of the toy back, because that's kind of the second, it's not as bad as the hitting.
Yep.
And we always say, what you're only responsible for your own actions. So if they say, well, of course I'm going to smack him. He took my toy. But you're not responsible for the taking of the toy. You are responsible for the hitting. And in this family, there is no hitting, no physical abuse, period. And just make that a rule.
I love the opportunity for kids to see things in different ways. We had Diane Gosson on the show, and she talked about restitution, and the part about it that I really loved was that the space gives kids the opportunity to think about, what kind of person do I want to be? So in this situation, what kind of brother do I want to be? When you ask, how do you think the other person feels? It really is asking you, how do you want to influence the way the other person feels? How do you want to shape the environment or the relationship that I have between this person? And it makes you then think about, even if you're not happy with sharing the toy, am I going to share the toy because this person will feel happy? Me having the toy that I wasn't intending to play with anyway is not going to do me any good, but it would make this other person happy. And what I did with my kids, because they're also just about 2 years apart, was that as long as there was no danger, I would take the toy and I would say, figure it out. When you have a solution, come and tell me what the solution is, and I give you back the toy. And it's not like figure it out yourself. It was like, I trust you to be a team to be able to figure this out. That was the energy that it came with. And they did that from toddler years, and now they're really good, like in seconds, because for them it's wasted energy to bicker. Because so you'll hear them quickly, all right, 5 minutes for you, then I get it, and quickly, and they work out a solution. And that has saved me from being the meanie who's always taking somebody else's side or getting involved, because usually when I make the mistake of getting involved, they both turn towards me and I become the bad person in the situation. So it's awesome that space allows them, again, empathy, creativity, and the development of that self-control.
Well, it also is something that we shouldn't overlook, that doing good things for other people makes people feel good, like themselves. So if I were to share with you, I get rewarded because it feels good to give. It's rewarding to be generous.
Yes.
And I think as parents, we should play to this a lot more than we do, because this is something that comes from within the child, and it is an immediate reward based on their own decision to act. And you know what doesn't do that? Me taking the toy from you and giving it to you. The action is the same, but who generates it makes a difference between resentment or reward in the child who has the toy that is not with them anymore.
Yeah, I love it. All right, you also have a quote that you use from Robert Doyle, who said that free will is a biological property, not a gift or a mystery. What does that mean to you?
So this goes back to the idea of synaptic development. And there is a premise in neuroscience that says that the pathways that are fired more frequently are more likely to be fired the next time. Mm-hmm. So the strengthening of what we use, basically, this use it or lose it principle. So if you have used a pathway, a connection between two neurons or a set of neurons, the next time that pathway gets stimulated, it will be more likely to fire with the same amount of kind of input in the beginning of that circuit. And that just basically means it's primed, it's ready to fire because it's been used once before. Now imagine if you've used that 20,000 times before, you'll barely need to do anything in order to have this message be passed. And that's where habits come in. So the habits end up being actually in your neural architecture. It is the paths that we've used before. And that, if you think about it, is our free will. In terms of that, we actually don't have an even playing field. The more decisions that we make, the more experiences that we have, the smaller our window of true choice is. So instead of just having, a person come in, who could choose A, B, or C in any given situation, they are way more likely to choose A, B, or C based on what pathways have been previously activated in their development by their parents, by the choices they've made coming in, even if they've never made choices and people have made choices for them. That is another way of shaping a person. And so we have this idea, in kindergarten classrooms where everybody comes in even and equal, and you're just going to teach them all the same. But really, we have kids coming in who have giant kind of predispositions towards acting in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And they're at a disadvantage coming in with these behavioral difficulties to learning, right? Same thing for an adult. If you have a kid that goes off to college, and we've been in this situation where we've basically controlled their behavior with a series of rewards and punishments their entire life, they're not actually free to make really great decisions because they've never practiced making really great decisions. So this idea of habits instead of free will is rooted in the connection between the neurons. So we really don't want to give up the idea of free will because we identify it with it so strongly as people. Like, the idea of not having free will would make everybody, I think, more depressed. It would make people, less likely to try hard because they feel like, oh, it's all predestined anyway. I'm just going to be who I'm going to be. I can't change myself. But it is interesting that even though our neuronal connections kind of sequentially take away some of that free will, it also is the very thing that brings it back. Because every time we make a different decision, it will be harder than making the decision we're used to making, but it's going to form different neural connections. And that process is ongoing until the day we die. Every time you make a different decision, you use a different pathway, you strengthen that other pathway. So it's not something that's only limited to the first 3 years of life or the first 5 years of life. This neurodevelopment's continuing throughout a lifetime. And so even as we're saying, my choices are becoming more limited as I'm becoming more neurologically who I am, we also always retain the capability to change and to grow and to do it differently.
I love it. What do you say then? So if we talk about the ease of doing something because it's repeated, what do you say then to parents who have the notion that I've told my kids enough time for them to know what I want them to do? So if they're doing the opposite, it's because they're doing it on purpose.
Well, they might be. I mean, that's a broken system. So if you're continually telling your child to do something and they're continually not doing it, they probably are not doing it on purpose because they don't value what you're asking them to do. If they valued it, then they would do it. And you can't force somebody to value it. Your job as a parent there is to try to figure out why they're not valuing it and to try to come around, get on their side with them, problem solve, say, this is something I need you to do. I understand you do not value it, as evidenced by your behavior in not doing it every time I ask you. We need to figure out a way that you can do it. Let me help you figure this out. This is going to be the dishes. This is going to be not leaving their shoes on the floor. Sometimes this is accidental, but even accidental behavior, right, is based on that you don't value whatever it is underneath it. And this idea of a value system can be hard because sometimes our kids' value systems are going to be different than ours, right? And so you have to make a judgment call. Is this a moral thing that if I feel like it is compelled, the kid is compelled to do it? Or is this something that there can be some choice here? Mm-hmm. So if you have a problem putting your shoes in the shoe bin and I have a problem with you having them on the floor every day, what is middle ground? What is it about the shoe bin that you can't do? Is it that it has a lid? Like, can you hang them up? Can you keep them outside? Like, this is where this creative kind of, what is the problem underlying the inability to follow through on the child's behalf? I don't think, like, from my experience with kids, it doesn't seem like most times when this happens, it's about the parent at all. Mm-hmm. They're not doing it not to disobey you or to get in your face, right? They're doing it just because they don't value the same things that you value. And so understanding that it's not about you as the parent, right, is really important in terms of trying to come up with a system that both parties are comfortable with. And for people who are used to controlling top down, this is hard because you don't want to ask the very person who's disobeying you to weigh in with feedback on how to make it easier for them. That's a really hard thing. But if you can do it in the small things, like the shoes, when you have a kid who's 16 and not coming home at night because you think they might be hanging out with the wrong people, that situation is now much easier because you did this when they were little with the shoes and not putting the shoes where they're supposed to go. What is important in terms of a value system, morality, where are the lines, right? Like, I have to know where you are at midnight if you're 14 years old, kind of thing, versus I have to not have a shoe in my foyer area. Like, there's a difference there. And I think as our kids get older, we need to make sure that we let go of some of that control as well. If your 16-year-old is still leaving his shoes in the foyer, but he's coming home, at 10 at night, he is getting at least the hard stuff, the stuff that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Erin, before I ask my last question, tell our viewers where we can find out more about you and your amazing work.
Oh, sure. So I have a website that's erinclaboughphd.com. And so that has links to buy the book. So the book, I have a book here. It's called Second Nature, and it's on Amazon in the UK. It's also like in a number of stores in the US, Barnes & Noble, and then the publisher Sounds True, so you can go directly to their website. I'm also on Instagram, Erin Clabough, PhD, Facebook, LinkedIn. And then I also am starting a series of videos based on the class that I taught at University of Virginia this year called Neural Basis of Behavior. So after every class, I did about 5-minute version for anybody who wanted to know the topic of that particular lecture. And so there will be about a month's worth, so like 30 or so videos that are about 5 minutes long. If anybody really wants to understand more about neuroscience and how the brain connects together, that's going to be a good resource for parents to go to on YouTube.
Beautiful. All right, my last question. What does it mean to you to live an empowered life?
I think living an empowered life means listening to yourself and then coming up with 18 ways to get to where you want to be without fear of failure, right? So some of those 18 ideas are going to be awful. And you just kind of need to embrace that that's going to be awful. And then you may end up with 2 or 3 really good ones. And the ability to evaluate those using, for me, my mode of understanding the world is information. So I'm going to get all the information about these, as much as I can. And then the ability to work towards that, that to me is empowering. So to be able to choose my own direction and to actualize it without fear of judgment from other people, that's empowering. And sometimes if you get judged by other people for what you're doing, that's something that you have to be able to have the resources to go through anyways. This intuitive thinking about where you're supposed to be heading is something that I've learned to listen to a lot more over the last couple of years. Something that before I think I always needed kind of a fact to back it up to say why I should be going that way. And so this idea of just listening to emotions as a gut impulse, gut feeling like in your viscera about what is right and what is wrong. This has been something kind of as a neuroscientist that I have had to really embrace, that those things are true and factual, even without having facts behind them. So that's been part of my journey towards empowerment, is understanding that it doesn't all have to be fact-based in order to drive me as a person towards where I feel like I need to be.
I love it. Thank you so much, Erin. This has been an amazing interview. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for bringing clarity to some of the most challenging parts of raising, especially younger kids, in terms of self-regulation and self-control. And just thanks for the amazing work that you're doing. It was
Thank you.
really a pleasure having you.
It is so nice to be on. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Empowered Kids TV. I'd like you to do us two favors. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe and press the bell icon so we can notify you of upcoming episodes and you don't miss any of our amazing programs. And if you found value, please share it. It still takes a village. So share this with your family and friends. As we always say here at Empowered Kids TV, you're just one connection away. With love and gratitude, empower us. Until next time.